Hiya, my name's Camille Branch. I am a second year history student at the University of Oxford, and I am currently working as a citizen journalist through an internship programme with Arts for Refugees. The reason that I wanted to work with Arts for Refugees relates to my own background. I am a second generation immigrant from an Irish family. My family moved here during the Troubles and faced a lot of discrimination. They ended up having to train themselves to speak without Irish accents in order to be able to avoid the prejudice that came along with being Irish in this country during the Troubles and during the period of time that preceded it. And so, for me, the study of colonialism throughout history and the consequences that it has had for people who were living in places that were once colonies has always been something that's super important to me. As part of my research, I've looked at Ireland extensively, but I've also looked at Indigenous communities in America and in Australia and explored the way that being colonised has had lasting impacts on those communities, on their life outcomes, on their chances, on health outcomes, and looking at a range of issues to do with that. And so that directly linked me to A4R because I really appreciated the way that they have worked to deconstruct the victim narrative that often surrounds refugees. Refugees and migration at the moment in Britain it's a contentious topic, and I think that a lot of the time people will look at refugees as a political pawn rather than giving them the social autonomy that they deserve. Refugees are not just passive players, they're not just pawns in a kind of game, they are independent people with their own thoughts, with their own ideas, with their own minds, with their own beliefs, and I think that A4R's ideas, which centre around providing refugees with a voice, making these stories of refugees known, and also illustrating the extent to which refugees have their own creative ideas and artistic ideas, is a really powerful one at deconstructing the narrative of victimisation that surrounds refugees. So yeah, I think the work that they're doing is super important, particularly at the moment, and that's why I chose to focus on two communities, two people, one person, one community during my time working with A4R that I thought particularly linked to this framework. The first one that I looked at was Belfast and Northern Ireland more broadly, through the context of the post-conflict prosperity, or lack thereof, in Northern Ireland since the end of the Troubles. In 1998, the Good Friday Agreement was brought about. This essentially brought peace to Northern Ireland. It granted Northern Ireland a degree of self-determinism and achieved a degree of self-governance, and it also began the process of demilitarisation in Northern Ireland. In spite of this, though, which was slightly unexpected when the agreement was first brought in, the Good Friday Agreement has not brought about prosperity in Northern Ireland. It's actually left a lot of people in the same position that they were when the Troubles ended and during the Troubles as well. And the reason for this is neoliberal urban policy. Neoliberal urban policy essentially centres around a free market idea that the areas that are most prosperous should be the ones that receive the most funding. And so this means that areas like the centre of Belfast, which during the Troubles was protected by a range of fortifications that allowed it to remain functional as an economic centre in the north of Ireland, remain the most prosperous areas of Ireland and attract the most investment. Whereas areas that are kind of inner city suburbs or areas on the outskirts of Belfast, which were hit very hard by the Troubles, had a lot of their infrastructure destroyed, had a lot of their commercial and business properties destroyed, have therefore become unprosperous and therefore do not attract investment. And so as a result of this, since the Troubles, there has been little prosperity in Northern Ireland for those areas. Areas that were wealthy during the Troubles have grown more and more wealthy, whereas areas that were damaged and impoverished during the Troubles have grown even more so. And this has had a range of outcomes for children living in those areas and growing up in those areas that are often incredibly negative. For example, children growing up in Belfast at the moment, 1 in 4 Northern Irish children are growing up in poverty. This has a range of quite significant outcomes for their life chances, and so it basically means that they can they'll end up having much worse life situations than wealthier counterparts, purely because of the areas that they were born in. So, evidence suggests that the gap in attainment between children growing up in poverty and their peers starts early, and it lasts throughout school. By the time they reach primary school, children from low-income families are already up to a year behind middle-income children in terms of cognitive skills. That is a quote from the Northern Irish Audit Office. There is also terrible nursery and childcare provision in Northern Ireland, some of the worst in the UK, which means that people from larger families are often trapped in a poverty cycle because parents are unable to go to work due to childcare needs. Children living in poverty are also much more likely to have health issues, especially mental health issues. Children who grow up in poverty are up to 4 times more likely to develop a mental health condition by the age of 11 than their counterparts who are growing up in wealthier conditions. This means that they will often grow up lacking security, whether it's food security, economic security, even housing security, and this can have a debilitating outcome on mental health. This also means that school attainment is largely much lower amongst impoverished children, meaning that they will struggle to break out of the cycle of poverty. Therefore, this entire situation is one that needs to be addressed. There has been efforts to address the issue of child poverty in Northern Ireland, but so far they have been fairly unsuccessful, and so much more needs to be done. The second topic that I focused on was the story of Marwan Musa. Marwan Musa was a Kurdish Syrian. He was born in 1967 in northeastern Syria, and his family is Kurdish, which means that they are part of the largest ethnic minority in Syria. However, in spite of their prevalence, Kurdish Syrians are often subject to extensive discrimination. For example, in 1962, in a very controversial move, 20% of Syria's Kurdish population was stripped of their citizenship. This meant that Kurdish Syrians had limited abilities to get an education, limited abilities to work in specific jobs, limited abilities to get married, and also couldn't emigrate because they had no national documents. And so this has led to a population of, it's believed to be, up to 500,000 stateless Kurds who do not have documentation and therefore are basically living without a state. This situation was already fairly bad for Kurdish people, but the situation for all of Syrians got worse during 2011 when the Syrian civil war broke out. The Syrian civil war began as protests against the repressive regime of Bashar al-Assad. Initially, there was civilian protests against the regime, but eventually these would develop into full-blown civil war with a range of factions fighting for different sectional needs and sectional beliefs. Marwan Musa and his family were quickly forced to emigrate due to this bloodshed. They fled to Iraqi Kurdistan in 2013, which was also a majority Kurdish region, where they lived in a refugee camp for 2 years. They were safe for the Syrian civil war at this point, but times were still incredibly challenging. Iraqi Kurdistan similarly has faced a lot of repression from the Iraqi government. Kurds in Iraqi Kurdistan have suffered genocide under Saddam Hussein and have also suffered a process of forced Arabization at multiple points during their history. In late 2012, when just before Marwan and his family moved to this area, there was rising tension between the autonomous Kurdish state and the Iraqi government, leading to skirmishes along the border. When they arrived, however, they also faced the difficulties of living in a refugee camp. They were living in a tent for 2 years, and this was a particularly challenging time, especially during the winter, when it would get incredibly cold. It was here that Musa began to create art. He started creating charcoal drawings. One of the drawings he made during the time depicts their tents, and is a reflection of how difficult it was living in that time. It was incredibly cold, it was difficult, and his son was fighting a rare genetic blood condition. The blood condition requires extensive treatment, including regular blood transfusions and often stem cell treatment, something that the family were entirely unable to access during their time in a refugee camp in Iraq. In 2014, the Syrian Vulnerable Persons Resettlement Scheme was set up by the UK government, which was aiming to bring high-risk people from Syria to the UK. This involved people requiring urgent medical treatment, survivors of violence and torture, women and children who were at risk. In 2015, the scheme was expanded to resettle 20,000 Syrians in the UK. Musa and his family were resettled in Belfast in 2016. They were able to access medical care for their son, Mohammed, and this was when Musa's paintings began to become more rich and more joyful. His son was receiving treatment, his family had a home, and the local council was gradually supporting their integration into Northern Ireland. It was through the help of a charity called Bernardo's in the UK, who were supporting the family, that Marwan Musa's work first got noticed by Deirdre Mackall. Deirdre Mackall was an arts programme manager at a local Belfast trust who helped to support marginalised groups. And it was through Deirdre Mackall that Musa was able to put on his first exhibition. He has continued to put on exhibitions since then and has also worked with local Belfast groups, including Action Ability, a group who support disabled people in the city. His life story is one of resilience and of hope, something that I found really inspiring. And I think it's also an example of the extent to which refugees are not just inautonomous players. He is and has spent his life very actively trying to protect his family, expressing his feelings through his art, and now giving back and expressing his passion through art in his local community of Belfast. I hope you enjoy reading the articles that I wrote, and have a nice day.